Hey guys, this is Matt from Amateur Filmies and welcome to a brand new video where I'll be ranking all of the films from the Friday the 13th franchise. I've been really excited to do this video because I've been wanting to rank a horror franchise for quite some time, and I marathoned these movies in preparation for this video, and of course it's quite timely given that the Scream Factory box set has just come out. But as far as how I'm going to be ranking these films, mostly basing it on the nostalgic aspect, how fun it is as a slasher movie, some of the characters and the story will play into it a little bit. For the most part, I'll be ranking it based on that, and I did want to make it clear that I actually do love all of these movies to some degree. So I know different people's rankings can be quite different from one another, and I might have some unpopular choices that I actually don't realize are unpopular. I'm sure you guys will let me know in the comments, but I just wanted to make that clear that regardless of where these films fall, I really love all of these movies to some degree. So coming in at number 12 is Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday. This actually has the unique distinction of being the first film to be released by New Line Cinema after the rights got sold. And I remember being a kid and watching this movie for the first time and feeling really duped by the title. The idea of Jason going to hell was something that, little me was really excited about, but of course it's not quite like that in the actual film. The plot of this one was ambitious, but I think it was a mistake, especially given that this was New Line's first entry into the franchise. I get that this was an opportunity to move away from the pre-established norms of the previous entries, but honestly, making your first film in the Friday the 13th franchise but having hardly any Jason in it was simply a misstep in my opinion. I always thought with this film that the premise would actually better suit just an original horror film, because I always did like the idea of, a killer being able to move between bodies to commit their crimes. It was also a missed opportunity to build upon Jason's backstory in a way that wasn't superficial. They do try to introduce some aspects of his lineage, but it's extremely rushed and not really capitalized on in any meaningful way. If they wanted to introduce a character as being Jason's half-sister, for example, I would rather have had a lot more time with that character, and I can even imagine a movie with her as a protagonist. There are some good aspects to this film, of course. I really like the gore in the movie, and in particular, I'm looking forward to the Scream Factory release because there's supposed to be some uncut footage included in this movie, so more gore is always better in these type of movies. And in particular, the body horror aspects, like some melting scenes from memory, I really liked that aspect. And, the end sequence, I'm not sure how people feel about it, but I really did like how the film ended with Jason sort of being dragged down to hell. I thought it was kind of creepy and also really cool as well. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, this just doesn't really do it for me as a Friday the 13th movie itself. As far as when it comes to ranking these movies, this one does hit the bottom for me. So coming in at number 11 is Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. This one was pretty much universally panned by critics and fans alike, although for unclear reasons, I don't know why, Sarah actually really likes this movie and places it towards the top of her list. Don't ask me what's wrong with her, I don't know. This film also misled a lot of audience members because, they marketed it as though Jason was going to be in Manhattan doing a lot of killings for the majority of the movie, but he actually was on a boat for most of the movies due to budgetary reasons, I believe. This film just felt extremely out of place compared to the rest of the series. In the first few movies, we get a direct focus on Jason's background, and then in parts 4 to 6, we get introduced to Tommy Jarvis and his character gets expanded upon, and then they do introduce a new protagonist in part 7 in the form of Tina, but Jason Takes Manhattan really fails to distinguish itself in any meaningful way, and it really does little to actually capitalize on the franchise's history and direction. It almost feels like a throwaway movie in some ways. Some of the cooler parts of the film are, of course, the unique funny kills in it. I've always been a fan of the overly long boxing match on the rooftop where Jason punches the dude's head off a building, and I know a lot of people do laugh at Jason's face reveal in this, but I think it's sufficiently creepy in its own way, and I also do like the visuals of the sewer flood scene, even if it doesn't really make that much sense. But overall, this is just a bit of a letdown for the franchise, but there are still some enjoyable aspects to it, I guess. So coming in at number 10 is Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. There are definitely fans of this movie, but I think it's safe to say that most people place this towards the bottom of their list, and of course that's what I'm doing right now. Now, the reason this is quite low on my list is not because it's just a plain bad movie or anything like that. I think for me, it's probably the best example of the franchise coming up with some really fresh ideas, but just executing them in a really poor manner. The idea of focusing on adult Tommy Jarvis as a person who's tortured by his past is a really compelling idea, but rather than utilize the charisma of the character that Corey Feldman brought to the table in the final chapter, we're given a character who actually hardly speaks the entire movie. Their intention was to show how damaged he is, but ideally he would have eventually opened up more, because in the end he is our main protagonist and we want someone interesting to help carry the movie. It is worth mentioning that Part 5 did try and build upon the comedy elements of the franchise, but it was actually mostly hit or miss, and in my opinion, mostly missing. The comedy was utilized a lot better in part 6, but we'll talk about that a bit later. I know a lot of people are divided on the idea of Jason not actually being the killer in this movie, but I do think it was, as I said, an ambitious idea. It's just the way they approached it, the way they handled it, that stifled it from being a really good examination of Tommy Jarvis's character arc and subsequently making it a more memorable entry into the franchise. So coming in at number 9 is Friday the 13th Part 3. Friday the 13th Part 3 is really a decent slasher movie, and I do enjoy rewatching this one, but the thing that really lets it down is how blatantly it copies Part 1 and Part 2. I think that's its biggest downfall, is the fact that it just doesn't introduce too many unique aspects to it. And again, of course, this is the movie that does bring us Jason's mask for the first time, but apart from that, there aren't really any distinguishing features about this film that really sets it apart. Now, you could argue that the 3D element of this film was their attempt to distinguish it from the first two parts, but in my opinion, it's just not enough to actually do that. That said, I actually do like the 3D aspect of it. I know it's really gimmicky and a lot of people hate it, but I don't know, it's like a guilty pleasure thing of mine. I really like it when I watch this movie. Even though the acting in this one is questionable, these characters are among the more memorable ones of the franchise for me personally. I really like the kills in the movie as well, and that character who always walks around on his hands, when he gets killed with the axe down the middle, I always laugh because I always think of the fact that the screenwriters just deliberately wrote a character who can do handstands just so they could get a good kill into the movie. I find that hilarious. There's nothing offensively bad about this movie, and as I said, I really do enjoy rewatching it. It's just the fact that they didn't really introduce any new elements, apart from Jason's mask, of course, but, you know, the blatant copycat formula of the first two movies is what made me lower this on my list, I think. So coming in at number 8 is the Friday the 13th reboot from 2009. I find it hard to gauge how fans of the franchise feel about this entry because it seems, you know, based on the lists that I've read and, you know, the videos I've watched of other people ranking this franchise, it seems to be one that a lot of people place either really high on their list or more towards the bottom. And I can see why it would be so divisive because, in my opinion, it does a lot of things right, but it does some things wrong as well. I know some people do take issue with the highly polished nature of this film, but you'll see from the other movies I placed higher on my list that that's definitely not a concern of mine. I don't mind that high polished, high budget look that a lot of the 2000s horror remakes got. You'll hear this talked about a lot, but it really is true. You know, the opening 20 or so minutes of this film are definitely the strongest of the entire movie. Jason's stature is very scary in this opening, and there really are some scary moments and some good kills. I also think it was a ballsy move to have the opening title show on screen like 20 or 25 minutes into the actual movie or whatever it was. But it was after this initial opening sequence that I started to lose interest personally. While I understand that strong character development isn't necessarily a priority of this franchise, and I'm not going to judge it too harshly on that, I did find that the characters in this film to be particularly grating and very annoying. The film is also oddly hyper-sexualized in both what is shown and the dialogue, and I understand that this is to some extent a common feature of the slasher genre, but it is extremely overdone in this remake and cost them the chance to make the characters more memorable on an individual level. I also like that as a reboot that it did make the effort to incorporate some elements from the original films to appease, you know, fans like us who are looking for little Easter eggs and stuff, you know, but most obviously a lot of things from parts 1 through 4 are incorporated into this film, but some of the really big moments in this film also feel a little bit underwhelming, like for example when Jason first gets his mask. It felt like a very forgettable scene, unfortunately. Overall, this is a decent entry into the Friday the 13th franchise that has both positive and negative aspects to it, but ultimately, for me, it feels more like a 2000s generic slasher film rather than a truly fun and imaginative reboot of the franchise. Coming in at number 7, we fittingly have Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. In this one, we're introduced to the new protagonist, Tina, and we have our first ever portrayal of Jason by Kane Hodder. This film is also commonly called Carrie vs. Jason because our main protagonist, Tina, has telekinetic abilities. I think I can definitively say that this is my favorite portrayal of Jason in the entire series. You know, the makeup is on point, you know, his costume just looks excellent and his hockey mask. His actual face reveal is terrifying to me, and just Kane Hodder himself brings a really intimidating presence to the franchise, I think. It is worth mentioning as well that Kane Hodder does a lot of really great stunt work in this, and it's cool to see Jason actually taking a decent bit of damage in this film. I will say that this film has some of the more forgettable characters in it, however. As I'm talking right now, I actually can almost barely remember what they even look like. I also personally hate the ending of this film. I'm not sure about you all, but when Tina's resurrected ghost of a dad comes back to help her, I just thought it was the dumbest thing ever. I was really disappointed in the ending, and I thought they could have done something a bit more action-packed and cooler. While part of me does wish that they continued with the more self-aware comedy-laden horror that Part 6 started, I do think that this is a decent entry into the franchise, and, you know, I think a continuation of Tina's story in Part 8 probably would have been a lot better than what we got in Jason Takes Manhattan, but I do acknowledge that there were probably contractual limitations and whatever that prevented that from happening. Next up, coming in at number 6, we have Freddy vs. Jason. I think fans tend to be a bit mixed on this film, but one thing I will say is that I absolutely love watching this movie. It's one that I can watch all the time whilst also acknowledging that there are plenty of things to pick apart in this movie. First off, I actually really like the concept that drives this film, that being that Freddy uses Jason as a pawn to instill fear into the teens of Elm Street so that Freddy can come back to reign terror. As for the characters, they are very memorable to me, but that's probably just because I've watched it so many times, but they really are, in the end, just a vehicle for exposition literally the entire movie. The dialogue in this movie is very bad. I get that they felt the need to catch the audience up on the backstories of these characters, but it's certainly overdone and makes up the large majority of the film's dialogue. With all that said, I do really like the kills in this one. I think there's some unique, fun ones here, and I actually really like the soundtrack as well. It brings back a lot of early 2000s nostalgia for me. And as I've said, you can pick this film apart, but it's probably the one that I've watched the most because I just love it so much. And, we get to see two major horror icons fight off against each other, so it's got that going for it too. So coming in at number 5, we have Friday the 13th, the original film. This is the film that started it all, and I actually quite like the original film. While it doesn't have the distinction of having Jason be the killer, this is actually the film that gives us the backstory that drives his motivations for the rest of the series. The characters in this are kind of bland, although it is cool to see Kevin Bacon in here too. It also can be a little bit slow at times, but not terribly so. Given that it's the first in the franchise and the kills are done from a first-person point of view, the film actually has the unique characteristic of having the identity of the killer be a mystery until the climax of the film. Of course, given how famous this franchise is, everyone knows who the killer is in the first movie, but it's still worth mentioning. Of course, I've mentioned this for all the other films as well, but I love the kills in this movie especially, and Tom Savini is here doing the makeup, which is always a great thing to see. While this film did lift all of the unique characteristics from the original Halloween movie, I think they utilized these characteristics really well and did a good job at paving the way for the future films to build off of. I think this is a really great slasher film in a period where they were just churning them out. If you want another film to, watch alongside this one apart from the sequels, you could always pair this with The Burning or Just Before Dawn, for example. Those are both also really good slasher films. Coming in at number 4, we have Friday the 13th Part 2. I do want to first acknowledge that this film is guilty of what I criticized Part 3 for, which is that it copies a lot from the previous film. That said, this film, unlike Part 3, did make a solid attempt to introduce some new concepts and backstory for the character. For one, they officially introduced Jason as the new primary antagonist of the series, and they provide some very direct exposition that gives us insight into his backstory. While the dialogue involved with telling us about Jason's backstory is a bit stilted and forced, we now know a bit more about Jason's motivations and history. I also really like Ginny as the final girl in this film. She's probably one of my favourite final girls of the entire franchise. She has a lot of charisma and she actually fights off Jason quite well. I always really liked the altar scene towards the end of this film as well, where we see Jason's shrine to his dead mum with her decapitated head on the tabletop as well. I always thought that was so creepy and horrific, and while the scene was a little bit hokey, I actually did like when Ginny donned Pamela Voorhees' outfit and tried to psychologically manipulate Jason as well. All in all, this is a very good follow-up to the original film and a great entry into the franchise, and is one that I do really enjoy rewatching. Coming in at number 3 is Jason X. I know we're definitely in controversial territory now with me putting Jason X so high up in my list, but I absolutely love this movie, and I think it is probably one of the funnest movies of the entire franchise. This is extremely cheesy and dumb in so many ways, but that's what they were going for. The kills in this are fantastic, and I adore the space setting despite how nonsensical and stupid it all is. The virtual reality scenes in this movie were such a treat, as I'm a sucker for those kinds of dated effects as well. And we even have a cameo appearance by David Cronenberg himself in the opening sequence of the movie, so need I say more? I also really like how we get the two different Jasons in this movie, his original form and then Uber Jason or whatever he's referred to when he gets rebuilt by the technology. I always thought that was really cool, and he actually looked kind of scary, even though also he looked a little bit dumb. I would totally understand if fans of the franchise said they hated this movie, but honestly, you can't deny that the fun factor with this one is enormous. Yes, it is an extremely dumb movie in so many different ways, but I love it all the same. This film knew what it was and played to its strengths, and for that, I can always come back and watch this one and have a good time. Coming in at number 2, we have Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. A lot of people do consider this the best film in the entire franchise, and I can definitely see why, because it really is one of the best films in the entire franchise for a few reasons. First off, we get introduced to Tommy Jarvis, who's probably the most notable and memorable protagonist that the franchise has ever had. He's played by Corey Feldman, who brings a lot of charisma to the role especially, which makes it even more memorable. The characters in the Friday the 13th films can definitely be hit or miss depending on which film you're watching, but I think the characters in this film are actually quite good. You've got Corey Feldman's family, you've got the teenagers in the other house, you've also got the guys sort of hiking around the woods, and sometimes having this many different characters can be a little bit distracting. I actually think it segments complements the film quite well, and they are all written in a pretty good way, I think. I haven't mentioned the tonal atmosphere that much in this video so far, but I will note that tonally this film is actually really good as a creepy slasher film as well. There's something about it that actually just sort of drives home that really cool 80s feel, and it is quite scary at points as well. Yet again, the kills in this one are quite good, and the gore and effects are actually really good in this one as well, but that's no surprise given that Tom Savini is back. I think the portrayal of Jason in this one is also very good. He's very creepy and intimidating at times, especially in the end sequence when he's sort of hunting down the Jarvis family, which also brings up another really strong point of this film, is it incorporates a lot of really well implemented tension as well. The final chapter recognizes the strengths of the first three films and combine them to make a very effective, memorable slasher. If you ask me what film best represented the franchise and encapsulated that sort of 80s slasher genre, I would say it's the final chapter for sure. So of course, at number 1, we have Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. Jason Lives is one of those Friday the 13th movies that I cannot wait to get to when I'm marathoning the entire series. It is probably one of the most fun movies in the entire franchise, and it's just a treat to watch. Jason Lives is one of the best examples of how a franchise can successfully shift from one tone to another, whereas the first few were obviously a lot more serious. This is now prioritizing a more comedy-laden horror, which I really appreciate and enjoy. I also really like the portrayal of Jason in this movie. I think he's very creepy and scary, and I absolutely love how he comes back in this film. The opening sequence is one of my favorite parts of the film, where you see Tommy Jarvis's character who returns. He ends up going to Jason's grave, and he gets resurrected by a bolt of lightning that hits his corpse. And speaking of Tommy Jarvis, this is by far my favorite portrayal of the character in the entire franchise. I think the actor Tom Matthews did a really great job, which is no surprise given that I really like him in Return of the Living Dead. And just the other characters in this film as well are really memorable and great, especially the sheriff. I think he's quite underrated too. I think the comedy in this film is approached very well, whether it be visual gags, funny character deaths, or even breaking the fourth wall at times. It's just very entertaining. And if you found that Jason X, or Freddy vs. Jason, was very entertaining but lacked in the story or writing department, Part 6, in my opinion, fills in those gaps, and it subsequently becomes one of the best, well, in my opinion, the best film of the entire franchise. So that brings us to the end of the video. Thanks very much as always for watching. I really appreciate it. Making this video was really fun because it gave me an excuse to marathon the entire series, which is always a good thing. Let me know what you think of my list and where I've placed certain films. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and whether or not you agree or disagree with me. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It would mean a lot to both Sarah and I. It'd be really great. And I actually do plan on doing more franchise rankings in the future. I think maybe the next one might even be a Nightmare on Elm Street, so I'm sure that'll be a lot of fun too. Thanks very much, and we'll see you in the next video.